African Ascent is privileged, not necessarily for the first time, but for a 10th, 15th time, as a matter of fact, according to some mathematical counting, to be the beneficiary of the productions and contributions of some of the most important works that are being done by the Berkeley faculty. My audience is quite spoiled, should I say, because we are so used to listening and visually interacting with these great thinkers, producers, activists, visionaries, film producers. The program, African Ascent, has been quite lucky to have covered a gamut and a spectrum of spectacular contributions from people dealing with some of the most perennial themes of the human condition. Consistent then with the generous support that African Ascent continues to get from the Berkeley College of Music, my guest tonight, this evening, will introduce us in a very original way to what it is that human beings do with language. Since language, philosophically speaking, is really the moral organizer of the self. When we organize the self, when we redirect it, and when we give it new directions, we essentially engage in all these activities by stimulating the linguistic vocabulary that is hidden quite deeply in our very unconscious. Professor Peter Gardner, an internationally acclaimed professor of ESL, among other things, is a prolific writer who has contributed to reviews of film, of music, of literature, and most particularly the needs of international students who come to the American shore to refine and develop their language skills so that they could be terrific musicians at Berkeley College of Music. He has worked in a very wide dimension of this field, this linguistic field, with a focus on the training and sculpting of international students. Consider, for example, one of his major works, which has been translated into so many languages, including Chinese, I believe, which is called New Directions, about which, when it is appropriate and if time permits, he will say quite a bit. So it is really my great pleasure then to bring a potential regular contributor to African Ascent, although he is very, very busy, to my audience tonight. I am honored and privileged to bring to you Professor Peter Gardner from Berkeley College of Music. Welcome to African Ascent.
Dankeschön, Tedros. Und vielen Dank für die schöne Vorstellung. Ich freue mich sehr darauf, hier heute Abend zu sein, um mit Ihnen und mit Ihrem Publikum etwas über interkulturelle Kommunikation zu reden und diskutieren. Aber ich würde meinen, Sie hätten es lieber, wenn ich jetzt auf Englisch rede, oder? No.
That was wonderful.
I was just speaking a little bit in German with you to throw us, or to throw you and some of the audience perhaps who doesn't know German, into this intercultural soup. One of my major goals as an interculturalist, and I think many of us who are interculturalists, is to develop a tolerance for ambiguity, a certain type of comfort with the discomfort, what the great romantic poet John Keats calls negative capability, the capability of being in doubt, in mystery, and uncertainty without a reaching after fact and reason, I think, as he puts it. So I think by starting that way, maybe people were a little bit startled, but one of the things I would like to cultivate in my students, I try to cultivate in myself, is that tolerance for the twilight zone. Being in the middle, having a type of mindfulness, having a type of Buddhist repose, without having a feeling that one has to immediately and viscerally come to some type of solution or some type of explanation. So I thought today what I might do is to give a general sense of intercultural communication, which is a relatively new field. I think when most people hear the term intercultural communication, they're not exactly sure what it consists of. To talk a little bit about the class I teach, to talk about some of my research, to talk about how I got involved in the field, to talk about my particular passion for the field, and then to focus in an inductive way on several of my major interests within the field of intercultural communication, showing how those particular instances reflect general principles about the field. Now, I think it's probably fairly clear to people why the great need for intercultural communication in an increasingly intercultural, interconnected global world, and that functions really sort of on a two-pronged level. One is increasing international contact, as we have a global economy, as we have new technology and information systems, as we have different environmental problems, conflicts around the world. And the other prong is really an increasingly diverse domestic workforce and environment in which many of us are living. So it's particularly important to be flexible intercultural communicators in an increasingly complex and interwoven world, a tapestry. Perhaps just to give you a sense of the general field of intercultural communication, I could just read very, very briefly the description of the course that I teach on intercultural communication because it lays out some of the general concepts. In this course, students learn about the major principles of intercultural communication. Students explore similarities and differences in cultural patterns around the world, values, beliefs, customs, verbal and nonverbal messages, ways of perceiving reality, types of social organizations, and worldviews. Students also explore the process of intercultural conflict and interaction, resolution, and the ways in which social and cultural forces influence people's lives, consciously and unconsciously. Emphasis is placed on obstacles to effective communication among people of different cultures and on ways to reduce these barriers. Students learn about the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary for effective intercultural communication and examine such issues as ethnocentrism, prejudice, cultural adjustment, gender roles, healthcare, education, family structure, music, and other art forms around the globe. I have a number of goals in my classes and in my own life as an interculturalist. And one of the ones that I mentioned, and I just mentioned here, was developing a tolerance for ambiguity, for uncertainty, which is really something that one strives for one's entire life. The second is developing the skills, the knowledge, and the attitudes, the mindset necessary to become flexible intercultural communicators, not just the knowledge. In too many classes, professors, I think, focus on the knowledge as opposed to the mindset, the perspectives with which one needs to view reality from different vantage points in order to understand both the world and oneself. Another major goal of the class is, and this is probably an essential one, is for us all to develop a sense of our own ethnocentrism. That is the extent to which we are consciously and unconsciously influenced by social and cultural forces, and the ways in which we look at the world through the rose-tinted glasses of the cultures in which we grow up, which I think is what the great French writer Agnès Nin means when she says, "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are." Another major goal of my classes, and something I'm very interested in, is looking at the cultural similarities and differences around the world. Now, those include things like values, beliefs, expectations, assumptions, perceptions, worldviews, verbal and nonverbal communication styles, what we in the field call the subject of culture, what is underneath the water and the iceberg on the top is the surface. Not unimportant, but what is more important and what causes more conflicts and stress and misunderstandings, so unconscious things, the invisible types of implicit things under the surface that cause the problems. Seems to me, often the two major problems in intercultural communication and dealing with different cultures and with conflict resolution and management is either focusing too much on the similarities or too much on the differences. So focusing too much on the similarities, we neglect the profound differences among cultures in worldview, in values, in perceptions, and so forth. But I often think that interculturalists focus too much on the cultural differences and neglect the very powerful, universal, social, psychological, physical, and emotional similarities that we share as human beings. So trying to get a sense of the balance between those two. I also focus a lot on barriers to effective intercultural communication, ways to overcome those barriers, and particularly, I don't particularly care for the word mindfulness because it is so overused and it's almost become a cliche today. Yes. But to listen to listen with all of our senses, and that's what in Chinese is called ting. So I try to give my students a sense of listening with ting. And if I could show that to the audience.
Please do.
This is the kanji, this is the symbol in Chinese of listening, and it is called ting. And we don't just listen with our ears, we also listen with our mind, we listen with our eyes, and we particularly listen with our heart. It's a very holistic, synthetic concept of listening. I think in this culture, when one thinks of listening, one just thinks of this type of listening. But a close colleague of mine, Dr. Stella Tingtumi, says this about listening, and this is probably the central goal of my intercultural communication classes, of people from different cultures when they come together and to try to understand each other with very different values, beliefs, and perceptions. She says, listen with your ears to hear the word, the tone, and the pitch. Listen with your mind to understand, to analyze, and to broaden perspective. Listen with your eyes to see the facial expression, to read the body language, and to look at the window of the soul. Listen to your heart to feel the emotions, to empathize, to respond. So I'm always trying to remember not just to listen with my ears, to listen with my eyes, to listen with my mind, particularly to listen with my heart. I thought now, in order to get a little bit more into the field of intercultural communication, I could read a very short article that I wrote last year in a local publication called Matsal Currents. Matsal stands for the Massachusetts Association of Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages. It's quite a mouthful. And this is a short cultural vignette based on an experience that I had in the classroom in which I wanted to reflect certain central concepts of intercultural communication that have interested me over a number of years and which I have written about and trained teachers and students about around the world. So this takes perhaps 4 or 5 minutes to read, if you would indulge me.
It's a pleasure. In fact, take
you.
your time. We have a lot of time.
Thank you
read
very
it slowly and make sure that we enjoy the reading.
Okay, thank you. I'll try. Several years ago, I was teaching an advanced English as a second language class at a college in Boston, Massachusetts. 2 weeks into a thematic unit dealing with intercultural communication, we were focusing especially on cultural differences in values, beliefs, and behaviors, and the misunderstandings and conflicts that often arise from these variations. We had returned several times to the dangers of ethnocentrism, the inevitable tendency to observe, interpret, and evaluate the world according to the assumptions and standards of our own culture. We discussed how this viewing of reality through tinted lenses often leads to a belief in the naturalness and rightness of the culture with which we are familiar, and the strangeness and inferiority of cultures that appear foreign. The students had just read an essay by a graduate student from China about the culture shock she experienced when first moving to the United States to pursue her studies in an environment with unfamiliar norms and practices. In addition to the informal attitudes and behaviors she encountered in the U.S., especially in educational settings, one of the cultural differences that struck her most was the direct and assertive communication style of people in the United States versus a more indirect and modest style of speaking in China. To illustrate this cultural difference, she recounted a personal experience near the beginning of her studies of going to visit her advisor, Dr. Green, at her home on a hot summer day. Shortly after the author's arrival, Dr. Green asked if she would like something to drink, and even though she was thirsty, she declined, saying, "Please don't trouble yourself." Dr. Green asked her if she was sure she really didn't want something to drink, and once again the author politely refused. Dr. Green then went into the kitchen to get something to drink for herself, and the two continued their discussion. The author was thirsty and confused, not understanding at all why her advisor hadn't asked her a third time if she would like a drink, and then insisted that she accept it, even if she had declined several times. This type of indirect, courteous speech and standing on ceremony would be the norm in China. Upon reminding my students of this anecdote, Avi, an Israeli student, exclaimed, "That's crazy. Why are the Chinese so dishonest and unconfident? In Israel, if we want to say something, we say yes, and if we don't, we say no. We don't beat around the bush." Seeing an opportunity to shed light on the pitfalls of ethnocentrism and stereotyping, I asked Shota, one of the Japanese students in the class, what he thought of this polite but thirsty story in the essay. He replied that in Japan, his response would have been similar to that of the Chinese author, and that he often felt uncomfortable in his college classes at Berkeley and in the United States, with students expressing personal opinions loudly, disagreeing with classmates and teachers, and behaving in a manner that would seem selfish, immature, and rude in Japan. He stressed the values of polite listening, humility, and respect for the group in his native culture. This led to a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of direct versus indirect communication styles, depending on the context, and the need to respect cultural differences and to avoid negative value judgments and stereotypes. At the end of the class, having listened attentively to the discussion and not having said anything since his first remark about the Chinese, Avi turned to Shota and jokingly said, "Then I must be the one who's crazy." The class laughed at Avi's self-deprecating remark, and he and the other students left the room with a new appreciation of the words I had quoted earlier by the French writer Agnès Nin. "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are." Now, within that anecdote, there are three particular aspects of intercultural communication that have interested me over many years. One is the whole concept of ethnocentrism that I'd like to talk a little bit about. Okay. One is cultural differences in the theory and practice of teaching, and the ways we as teachers can enhance our teaching and our students' learning in a multicultural environment. And the third is a very profound interest of mine, and one that I think causes tremendous intercultural conflict, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, tension, is cultural differences in verbal communication styles, which essentially means what people say, how they say it, what they mean when they say it, what they don't say, and what they mean when they don't say something, which differs tremendously across cultures. So just, a couple of very brief words about ethnocentrism. Of course, it comes from the Greek ethnos, meaning group or nation, and kentron, centered, so centered on the group. But if you look up the traditional dictionary definition, it will say something like a belief in the superiority of one's own culture, which is a very limited way of looking at ethnocentrism from the point of view of an interculturalist.
I see.
As I was saying in the article, for me, it's a much more holistic concept involving the inevitable tendency, we all do this, to observe, interpret, and evaluate the world according to the cultural lenses with which we grow up. It functions largely on an unconscious level, which is one of the reasons it's so insidious. Sometimes it has very positive influences, creating a sense of group solidarity and group identity. But more often than not, ethnocentrism is an extremely corrosive force in the field of intercultural communication. Since, as you mentioned, I have a very strong interest in social linguistics, let me just mention, a couple of examples of linguistic ethnocentrism. The ancient Greeks, when speaking about the neighbors around themselves who didn't speak Greek, referred to those people as babarikos, which some people feel means sort of baba, we can't understand these people. And some feel that babarikos refers to bow wow, the sounds that a dog makes. So totally dismissing and belittling the other with that linguistic term. There are many, many cultures around the world that place themselves at the center of the world. For example, a country in which I have lived and taught, Japan, of course the Japanese don't refer to their country as Japan, they refer to their country as Nippon, which means the land of the rising sun. The country is at the center of the universe. If you look at the two kanji symbols, which comprise China, it means the middle kingdom. Again, the center of the universe. If you think of Mediterranean, meta terra, the middle of the earth. You have many, many cultures which refer to themselves linguistically as the real people. For example, take the term Eskimo, the indigenous people to Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. Well, Eskimo is not a native word. Eskimo is the word that is used, it's an Indian word used by the neighbors to mean raw flesh eaters. It's a very pejorative term. Of course, the term that the indigenous people used to describe themselves was Inuit or Inuit, meaning the real people. If you think about the term Bushman of Kalahari Desert in South Africa, well, that's a purely European term, meaning people of the bush. The people themselves referred to each other as the Juwazi, meaning, again, the real people. Another example, the World Series. I mean, what does the World Series of baseball have to do with the world? As far as I know, there's only one other country involved, which is Canada. I don't know much about baseball, but I think that's the case. Think of the geopolitical terms developing country, developed, undeveloped, third world countries, or perhaps a more neutral term that I've heard recently, emerging countries. Another example that's always intrigued me is the construction of maps. Traditionally, although it's changing, if you look at maps that were constructed in the United States, you see the US at the center of the map. When I visited some of my my French Swiss relatives, I have Swiss and US dual citizenship, they have a map of the world in which Europe is at the center. If you look at Cathay Pacific Airways, you see Australia, at the middle of the universe. Another example. Let me give you a wonderful example of by Bertrand Russell. I'm sure familiar as a philosopher with whom you're intimately familiar. A wonderful, very influential British mathematician and philosopher who gives a striking example of scientific ethnocentrism. And this one I would just like to read because he is such a wonderful writer. Bertrand Russell says, "I once observed that animal behaviorists studying the problem-solving abilities of chimpanzees consistently seem to detect in their experimental subjects the national characteristics of the scientists themselves. A divergence in the findings of the practical-minded Americans and the theoretical-minded Germans was particularly apparent. Bertrand writes, animals studied by Americans rush around frantically with an incredible display of hustle and pep, and at last achieve the desired result by chance. Animals observed by Germans sit still and think, and at last evolve the solution out of their inner consciousness. In science, Germans tend to come up with things like the uncertainty principle. Americans tend to come up with things like the atom bomb. So, again, we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. Now, there are so many other examples that I could mention, and maybe I'll just take 5 minutes to mention a couple in this field of cultural differences in nonverbal, but particularly verbal communication style. The ethnocentric perceptions and some of the pitfalls that are inherent in verbal differences, in cultural differences in verbal communication style. Now, one of the ones I already discussed in this little cultural vignette, and that's one of the central axes on which cultures differ, and that is how direct and how indirect is the communication. And we already saw the problems that caused in that cultural vignette. It's probably the axis of which reflects the least understanding by cultures, which reflects the least consciousness by cultures, and which reflects the most problems. How direct and indirect. So indirect cultures, say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't beat around the bush. Yes means yes. Tell it like it is. Now you get indirect cultures where it's exactly the opposite, much more circular, much more indirect. Don't tell it like it is. That can threaten harmony and saving a face. Yes might mean yes, it might mean maybe, it might mean no. It's necessary to read between the lines, to infer. Beating around the bush is sometimes the most effective way to achieve one's goals. And you get this, in all areas, from proverbs to the ways people interact. I'll just read a very, very quick. One of my colleagues, he's a major interculturalist in this country, has written a very, very short description, and I think you'll appreciate it, of Milton Bennett, an interculturalist. A group of African and American students are together in the United States, and they're discussing something. And he shows how one African student he's arguing something, he's describing something, and he comes to meaning and conclusions in a very different way from the American students, who are very direct, who are very explicit in their approach to argumentation. And he describes it in the following manner. He says, I had asked a question about early dating practices, and the Americans all answered with fairly concise statements that made some explicit connection to the question. When a Nigerian in the group replied, however, he began by describing the path through the village, the tree at the end of the path, the storyteller that performed under the tree, and the beginning of the story the storyteller once told. When, in response to the obvious discomfort of the Americans in the group, I asked the Nigerian what he was doing, and he said, I'm answering the question. The American students protested at that. So I asked, how are you answering the question? He replied, I'm telling you everything you need to know to understand the point. Good, said one of the Americans. Then if we're just patient, you will eventually tell us the point. No, replied the Nigerian. Once I tell you everything you need to understand the point, you will just know what the point is. It's very similar to the ancient Chinese East Asian notion, which lives on today through the influence of Confucianism in China, in Japan, in Korea, of not stating your point up front, for example, when arguing. Rather, one is peeling the layers of an onion, and the point only becomes clear near the end. Now, if you state your point too directly and too clearly at the beginning, it seems egotistical, it seems overly simplistic, it seems immature, and it seems aesthetically displeasing. And so I deal with this as an interculturalist all the time, especially when reading students' essays, when American students are taught, state your main point in the introduction and then back it up in each paragraph throughout the essay. As opposed to many, for example, East Asian cultures, where you lead the reader on a path, often in a circumlocutionary manner, and you arrive at the meaning at the end. So you can imagine the problems involved with direct and indirect communication. The same thing, for example, with formal and informal communication. Informal communication tends to be more common among individualistic cultures that stress self-reliance, that stress independence, doing one's own thing, originality, creativity. So the language tends to be more informal. There are fewer honorifics or titles of respect, as opposed to more formal cultures, which is most of the world, for example, Latin America, the Middle East, many African cultures, many Asian cultures, many Middle Eastern cultures, in comparison to many English-speaking cultures, where there's much more formal discourse in terms of titles, in terms of extensive greetings when one meets somebody. So I'll just tell you a very brief anecdote of a Korean student at Berkeley. There's a tremendous problem in intercultural communication with what names and what titles does one use. Now, it's very common in the United States to use first names, Christian names. You know, going to, for example, a restaurant. My name is John, I'm going to be your server tonight. First names among colleagues, among people who have never met each other, often between teachers and students, sometimes between parents and children. Well, of course, that would be very inappropriate and disrespectful in many parts of the world. So I had a Korean student once who was relating this experience to me in a journal. Now, in most parts of the world, there are very formal terms to refer to professors. For example, in Japan, one would say sensei Gardner, or Gardner sensei, master. Lao Shi in China, maestro in Mexico, guru in Indonesia, which is a Sanskrit word meaning weighty or venerable. In Austria, Herr Doktor or Herr Doktor Professor. Well, this Korean student, coming from a very formal verbal communication discourse culture, asked my colleague at Berkeley a question, and he said, Teacher Jones, could you please, no, please don't call me Teacher Jones, call me John. Well, a week later, the student, being uncomfortable with calling him John, said, Dr. Jones, could I ask you, no, please call me John. The next time, Professor Jones, the next time, Mr. Jones, and the result was that with the teacher insisting upon calling him John, the student never spoke to the teacher again. Incredible. So, one of these ethnocentric ways of, we grow up with those lenses, those perspectives. I would always encourage a teacher to err on the side of formality as opposed to informality. But this was a student who was profoundly interested in the topic and engaging with the professor and never spoke again, for the rest of the semester. And just two very quick other examples of cultural differences in verbal communication style and the ways that these reflect ethnocentric perspectives and the potential for conflict. We spoke about direct and indirect, formal and informal, emotional and non-emotional. Now, I don't want to oversimplify, and I don't want to create a dichotomy between the West and the East, because there are so many exceptions. Everything focuses on a continuum. But primarily, I think that students in this culture are taught, at least in their verbal and in their nonverbal discourse, to place emphasis on objectivity, on an empirical tradition, not to bring in too much subjectivity, not to bring in too much emotion. Now, that's very, very different in many cultures of the world. For example, many Slavic cultures, many Arab cultures, many Latin cultures, even certain African cultures, where one is supposed to be subjective, where one makes very personal, subjective, emotional arguments and appeals. Now, to the American, that seems, and I really don't like the word American because that's ethnocentric in itself, so I apologize. As an interculturalist, I usually say U.S. American. We have North Americans, Central Americans, and South Americans, but too much emotionalism to an American, it feels childish. It feels that it's lacking in intellectual rigor. It feels that it's lacking often in intelligence. It feels that it's lacking in engagement. It feels that it's reflective of diversion and not really telling the truth. Exactly the opposite. If you get somebody from an emotional culture looking at an objective culture, they think that you are unengaged, that you are insincere, that you are not reflecting the truth because you are using too many brief, short, objective words, which cannot reflect the complexity of reality. And so you get these comments all the time by, for example, Middle Easterners. Americans are too aloof, and U.S. Americans, this group is too emotional. This group relies too much on personal appeals. This group relies too much on abstract logic. A lot of problems. And the very last example, and then we could engage in some discussion, is succinct versus, let's see, what do I want to call it? The first one we were calling, direct and indirect methods of communication, formal and informal, and emotional and non-emotional, elaborate and succinct, which refers to how much value is placed on verbal production versus silence. So traditionally, in the Eastern tradition, and again, I don't want to set up some type of simplistic, polarity or duality, but generally in Eastern tradition, silence, the perception of silence has been looked upon as positive. It is something that reflects contemplation, that reflects reflection in itself, respect, harmony, saving of face, and engagement. In the Western world, even today, going back hundreds of years, silence is generally seen as something negative, as asocial, as a whole, as something to be filled, as lacking in engagement, as lacking in participation. And something that has really interested me recently is, if you talk to an American, they associate participation with verbal participation. There's certain types of silent participation. So the last thing I would say is that it's very interesting to me that at the very same time, in the 6th century BCE, in the East and in the West, there was an absolutely different perspective. For example, Lao Tzu, the great ancient Chinese philosopher and founder of Taoism, promoted the virtue of silence. Those who speak do not know, and those who know do not speak. And Confucius, or how they pronounce it in Chinese, Kung Fu Tzu, was saying exactly the same thing. The very same time in the Western world, the Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were promoting the value of debate, of rhetoric, of discussion, of dialogue. And those very ancient patterns, I think, very much influence verbal communication styles today. And so I'd like to end with a very brief quotation and leave time for some discussion. This is by an ancient Chinese philosopher, again, in the 4th century BCE, Chung Tzu. And he says, "How shall I talk of the sea to the frog if he has never left his pond? How shall I talk of the frost to the bird of the summer land if he has never left the land of his birth? And how shall I talk of life with the sage if he is a prisoner of his doctrine?" And as I wrote once in an article, intercultural communication helps us talk of the sea to the frog and the frost to the summer bird, urges us to leave the safety of familiar shores for unknown land, and helps free us from the shackles of our own doctrines.
Incredible. Okay.
Now, one could speak for hours, but
course.
perhaps it raises a few questions that we could engage in dialogue.
It's remarkable, and I would like to publicly thank my guest for an extraordinary mini lecture, on interculturalism that will be of use to just anybody who has listened to this program, and our viewers are quite substantial without reading a major text on the theme. You have managed to summarize the essential facets of the intercultural activity, which is a modality of speaking, and defended it quite compellingly. And so, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, I have two concerns, two themes that I was thinking about as you were doing the mini lecture, a remarkable mini lecture. They are these. The first concerns my admiration of Bertrand Russell, whom you also admire, because my training as a professional philosopher is in analytic philosophy, which is a kind of philosophy that cherishes what we call linguistic clarification, by which we essentially mean an attempt at, if we can do the task successfully, ridding language, helping language to be freed from ambiguities. On your view, ambiguities, culturally speaking, seem to be necessary and sufficient conditions for speaking any language with an apparent complexity. Whereas for us, the analytic philosophers, ambiguity and metaphors tend to clutter language. Therefore, we try to save language, to free it from complexities and ambiguities.
Yes.
Bertrand Russell, for example, distinguished quite brilliantly in his earlier career between what he called atomic statements and molecular statements. An atomic statement for him is a statement that cannot be reduced any further, since its minutest part, the part, is so clear that anybody who listens to that part being articulated understands it completely and correctly. Whereas molecular statements are combinations of two atomic statements. For example, John is a human being is an example of an atomic statement. Whereas John and Peter went shopping is an example of molecular statements. In a molecular statement, we sense the presence of two atomic statements which need to be decoupled, so that once we decouple them, then we're left with two atomic statements which stand on their own and are readily understandable, clearly and perfectly, so forth and so on. So what are your thoughts on the role of ambiguity and complexity in language? Is it the case that human beings misunderstand each other because our languages are so ambiguous and complex? Or is it the case that we misunderstand each other because our languages are not sufficiently ambiguous and complex? What's your take on that?
Well, that would take about 3 hours to discuss, but I would say whether or not it is cultural or a non-cultural issue, you know, ambiguity and clarity always function as important parts of communication. Now, when talking about communication, of course, one has to talk about the context of the communication, the goals of the communication, the individual styles of the communicator, and the cross-cultural differences. I respect what Bertrand Russell is saying, but to me, as an interculturalist, and who is it for me to, to disagree with a profound philosopher like Bertrand Russell? But as an interculturalist, it is a bit too absolutist for me. I come from a more relativistic perspective, which looks at different types of functions, different types of purposes, different types of contexts of verbal communication. And I don't think, actually, practically speaking, that one can ever reduce anything to, some simple atomic, element or whatever it is. I mean, everything always involves complex levels of reality. I realize in the Western world we tend to stress more surface or one level of reality versus, Hindu tradition, where there are multiple, levels of reality. But I think, to answer your question, it is always, whether or not one is talking about two people within a certain culture or intercultural communication, there is always a necessary and inevitable balance of clarity and ambiguity. And both are equally important and necessary, and I certainly wouldn't privilege one over the other. It depends absolutely on the context in which one is speaking and upon one's goals. But there are very profound cultural differences which interest me, and that is in cultural perceptions of ambiguity. And as I was saying, in many what might be referred to as indirect cultures, it is profoundly important to develop the ability to understand what ambiguity really means. I mean, ambiguity doesn't just mean, well, it could go this way or could go that way. It's perceived in a much more complex, holistic, synthetic manner, which is integrally related not only to what one is saying, but to how one is saying it, and taking into consideration perhaps something that Bertrand Russell is not taking into consideration, or perhaps he is, and that is the intercultural relationship. That is the relationship between the two individuals. So, of course, in more Eastern-oriented cultures, where there is a stress on collectivism, not as a political term, collectivism, group harmony, saving face, working together, which has always been a necessity politically, socioeconomically, philosophically, in all sorts of ways. It is absolutely crucial to develop the ability to infer meaning, to read between the lines, to cultivate the ability to, and I would relate, as I was saying, earlier, ambiguity and also, uncertainty, that comfort with both.
It's remarkable, although you're attracted to Russell, from what you were saying, you seem, I don't know how consciously, to be attracted to Wittgenstein also, who began his career as a student of Bertrand Russell, and Russell considered him to be brilliant, but then who later began parting company from his teacher, because he became very sensitive to what you were referring to, the usages of context, use, sense, that determine the meaning of words. Words are not necessarily these static things that we append meanings to, he contended, but their meanings evolve and develop precisely because of the various ways in which they are used.
Yes.
And in this usage, I think, what you call interculturalism plays a major role.
Yes.
And now the interview has hardly begun, because the mini lecture was so compelling. But I have one final question that I've been thinking about. This arises out of my experience, limited experience at Berkeley, having been there only for 4 years of teaching foreign students in the classroom. As you know, not all the foreign students that we teach at Berkeley are necessarily immediately competent in the use of English. So when they take my philosophy courses, what I encourage them to do, and perhaps I should not be encouraging them to do this now that I've been listening to you, is to think in their native languages and then write in the language in which they are being expected to write. And in that, when I read their essays, I have a tendency to complete their thoughts for them, since I myself is an intercultural being. From what they say, I sometimes sense that they have not said what they meant to say. So I retranslate and improvise on the basis of what they are not saying, so as to get a sense of what they may be saying. Am I correct in having developed this empathetic style of engaging them in English, or should I be encouraging them to master English even more, so that they themselves could say what they would like to say?
I think, it's actually both. The only thing, I agree, I think actually what you're doing is tremendous. If you are trying in the same way that they are, and most of these students are very limited in terms of their linguistic repertoire. Not all of the international students at Berkeley. Of course, as we know, some of them are very, advanced. But we have about 25% of students who are really relative beginners. Now, by the time they get to your classes, they're a little bit higher. The one thing, I agree with everything that you're talking about in terms of engaging the students and trying to think in the same ways that they are, in this type of empathetic learning, which I was listening that I was talking about at the beginning in terms of Ting. Tremendous. And improvising on it, and it might be an incorrect improvisation, but then you can intersect with the students and see what they think. But I actually would not encourage my students to try to think first in their native language, because that inevitably results in some type of translation. I'm not I was talking to my students about this today, both that dictionaries can be their best friends or their worst enemies, but encouraging them not, for example, to write their essays in their native language and then translate them into English. And I really am not sure exactly what the psychological processes are that are involved in it, but all I know is after 30 years of teaching, that students who write first in their native language, or even those who tell me that they think things through first in their native language and then try to translate it into the other language, it always sounds like translated discourse.
I see.
And it's a very complex process, and I wouldn't speculate as to why that is. So, but I would like to say that the second part, of what you were saying, I think is absolutely fabulous. You're being flexible, you're being empathetic, you are trying to understand what they are saying, and reading between the lines. And ultimately, as you say, you are then going back and trying to help them develop their own linguistic skills, which also involve the cultural understanding of the use of languages, and English in particular. So I think you're absolutely on the right track and are guided. You are not benighted, you are knighted.
Well, I thank you so much.
I benight you into the field of ESL.
Well, I thank you so
Gladly.
much. I felt so comforted. And now we have about a minute left, and I would like to give you the rest of the time to say just about anything that you would like to say on the behalf of the mini lecture that everybody enjoyed.
Well, maybe I could just say something about why I am so interested in the field of intercultural communication, which started in about 1974 when I spent a junior year abroad in Germany. Understanding other cultures, understanding those different perspectives, the ways of thinking, feeling, believing, and behaving, I think can be such a powerful tool in terms of enhancing intercultural communication, in terms of solving world problems, which are tremendously difficult, in learning about the world, but ultimately then in coming back and learning about oneself. So what excites me most about the field of intercultural communication are the little epiphanies that I still have after 40 years, when I think that something is either universal, and I learn that it's culturally based, or I think that it's culturally based and it's really universal. And those types of moments, which still happen 40 years later, not infrequently, excite me so much. And if we can open people's minds and eyes and ears in that way, I think we will have a much more friendly and productive world.
This has been your host for African Ascent, Theodoros Kiros. Good evening.